Okay, we are good to go.
Okay. Welcome to the January 11th, 2022 meeting of the CB6 Budget and Governmental Affairs Committee. My name is Reshma Patel, and I am chair of the committee. This meeting is called to order at 6:34 p.m. Tonight, we are joined by Assistant District Manager Brendan Berth. Members of the public, you can raise any questions or comments that you have through the Q&A feature of Zoom. If there is a time following the committee's discussion, we will field questions from the public. It is with a heavy heart that I begin this meeting today with sharing the news of the passing of our chair, Rick Eggers. Rick was not only chair of this committee, but he was also past chair of Community Board 6. His contributions to CB6 and our community were invaluable. And he served as an incredible resource and mentor to new CB6 members like myself, and he will be greatly missed. We will hopefully, let everybody know on the committee. We will hopefully have something to commemorate Rick at some point. Beatrice Disman is taking meetings for tonight's meeting. Thank you, Beatrice, for stepping up to take minutes again this month. As a reminder, everyone on the committee is expected to volunteer to take minutes. You all should have received an email from the board office with a link to a doodle sign-up sheet for minute takers at committee meetings for 2022. For your convenience, the link to the sign-up sheet is being posted in the chat right now. Brendan, if you put it in the chat.
Yep, it's in the chat.
Okay. And we will now take attendance by roll call. Brendan will conduct the roll call.
Committee members, I will call your name and you will unmute yourselves. When your name is called, please say present. I will announce if there is quorum. Jim Collins. Okay, I do not see Jim. B. Disman.
Present.
Eva Marie Lassiter. I do not see her present. Karen Moore. I do not see Karen either. Steve O.
Present.
Reshma Patel.
Present.
Brian Van Nieuwenhoven.
Present.
And Claudel Winfield.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, Brendan. The agenda for tonight's meeting was distributed ahead of time by the board office and is reflected on the screen before you. If there is no objection, we will adopt the agenda. Members of the committee, if you object to adopting this agenda, you may raise your hand through Zoom. Seeing no objections, the agenda for tonight's meeting is adopted. The minutes for the November 8th meeting were distributed ahead of time by the board office. If there is no objection, we will adopt the minutes as drafted. Members of the committee, if you object to adopting the minutes, you may raise your hand through Zoom. I'd also like to acknowledge Jim Collins, who took the meetings for our November meeting. Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome. I'm on phone call. I'm not on Zoom. Not feeling terribly well today.
Okay, I will make sure you are marked as present, Jim.
And
Thank
thank
you.
you for joining. Seeing no objections, the minutes from the November 8th meeting are adopted. They will soon be available on the CB6 website. In order to conduct an efficient meeting, let's observe a few ground rules. No one may speak until granted the floor. Committee members, if you have a question about committee business or wish to make a motion, please raise your hand through Zoom. And Brendan, I'll ask you to keep track of who's raising their hands because sometimes I don't see it.
Yep.
The chat function should not be used for committee business or questions about agenda topics. All such remarks should be made on the record by raising your hand through Zoom. Chat should only be used to alert us to any technical difficulties you're having or to state in writing information like an email address that was already stated aloud on the record during the meeting. When a committee member is given the floor to speak, I will identify you and you can unmute yourself so that you can speak. We are required by New York State law to have a transcript of this meeting. So please keep your questions and comments succinct and germane to the discussion. The order of the adopted agenda should be followed. Tonight's agenda, a discussion of Senate Bill S-808, legislation which would eliminate the sub-minimum wage for food service workers, service employees, and miscellaneous industry workers who receive tips, the chair's report, and then any old or new business. So for our meeting today, we have two guest speakers. And I don't know, I guess I haven't seen one of them, but Sam Vasquez from Senator Brad Hoylman's office has joined us once again. And thank you, Sam, for always responding to our queries and attending our meetings, and also to Senator Hoylman for being a sponsor of so many bills, or co-sponsor. And so Senator Hoylman is co-sponsor of S-808 in the state Senate. And Sam is here to tell us a little bit about that. And then we have a speaker for One Fair Wage, which is the advocacy group that has been behind this bill, and they're supposed to join us tonight. And so I know, Brendan, you emailed them. Let me see if, I don't know if you have a phone number, I'm not sure, but let me check.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just before we continue, I see Claude's hand is raised.
Okay.
A simple question. Can we at some point identify who the guest is on the phone? The person that's,
423, yes.
yeah.
Oh, I see. Yes, it's not just Jim on the phone.
No, it's
Yeah.
Jim is on the phone, but somebody else is also.
Who is the number that ends in 423 that has joined us?
It may be me. This is Eva Lassiter. There was a connection problem. If you could please mark me as present. Thank you, Eva Lassiter.
Yep,
Thank
I'll mark you as
Eva.
present. And also indicate that it is you.
Thank you.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Okay, I'm just messaging to make sure that there's no issues with Zoom. But Sam, I don't know if you would want to just give us an update from your office while we are waiting.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm happy to answer any questions about the bill. I can give a brief overview about what the bill does. Senator Hoylman is a co-sponsor and is supportive, but he's not. But the bill was introduced by Senator Biaggi. But yes, I can give a little information about the bill. So it basically provides that would get rid of the sub minimum wage for tipped workers and would require a number of industries to scale up to the minimum wage and then allow for tips on top of their wages is ultimately what it comes down to. There's a lot of reasons to do that, and I can get into them. I can also take any questions. I don't know what works best for you all. Or are there any specific types of, I don't know if you guys want also some background on what's happening in the Senate, anything like that would be, if that would be helpful too.
Yeah, it would be helpful to give us some background on what's happening in the Senate.
Sure. So today was the second full day of the legislative session since the beginning of the year. And yesterday and today we passed a number of bills, including an election reform package yesterday. And This bill is being discussed in conference and is being considered. I know that activists like One Fair Wage are working hard to bring on a number of our colleagues that haven't signed up already. It does already have a lot of sponsorship in the Senate. I think there's a little, I'm not fully aware of the status in the Assembly, but I know that there's a little bit more concern there. I think we have almost, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's almost 10 co-sponsors in the Senate. So there's wide support. And I know that One Fair Wage had let me know that this is also of interest to our new governor, Governor Hochul. So there's a lot of moving parts. I'm not sure exactly when it might move, but it's definitely something that's being seriously discussed in the Senate right now.
Thank you. I see B has her hand up. B, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Sam, I have a question. When I read the background, it appeared that in 2019, the former governor was able to eliminate the subcategories in certain professions, but did not include that of the restaurants and some of the other miscellaneous stuff. Is it possible, since he did it by executive order then, is it possible to do this by executive order, or does there have to be legislation?
My understanding is that yes, and it can be done by executive action. I know that that's something that Saru and One Fair Wage have been pursuing, and I can let her speak to those efforts as well too. I know that I just saw that she joined us.
I'm so sorry. I thought I was supposed to join at 6:45. My apologies. My deep apology.
Oh no, my apologies for any confusion that we caused there. So I apologize. And I'd just like to introduce Saru, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If I'm not, please let me know. And Saru is the president of One Fair Wage and the director of the Food Labor Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley. And she has spent 20 years organizing and advocating for raising wages and working conditions for restaurant and other service workers. And as Sam mentioned, they have been advocating for S-808 at the state Senate level and an equivalent bill in the state assembly. And I'll just let her give you more information about it. She's the author of multiple books. She has, considerable amount of experience in this area. And I'm hoping that we can learn a lot this evening. Thank you, Sarah.
So much. Thank you, Reshma, for inviting me. And thank you to all of you for considering this issue. We so appreciate it. And especially now with the pandemic and with Omicron, this issue just gets more and more and more dire for one of the largest workforces in New York State and across the country. So thank you for having me. I'm going to talk as quickly as I can to give you background on the issue and both the executive process, which to your question, Beatrice, we've been fighting for several years, and on the legislation. So super quickly, as Resha mentioned, I've been doing this for 20 years, started this work after 9/11 together with workers from Windows on the World, which was the restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Tower 1. On that morning, 73 workers died in the restaurant, and about 13,000 restaurant workers lost their jobs in restaurants following the tragedy. And I was asked as a young organizer and attorney at the time to start an organization, a relief center in the aftermath of the tragedy to help restaurant workers get back on their feet. And what started as a relief center post 9/11 grew into a national movement of restaurant workers across the country fighting to raise wages and working conditions. We grew to 20 states, and in every state we went to, we'd ask workers, what are your top concerns? And everywhere we went, workers would always say, my wages, my wages, my wages. And as a professor, as an academic, I was always simultaneously, while talking to workers, researching why what they were saying was the case. And when you look at the data and the history, you understand why workers continuously say the wages are the problem. The restaurant industry has been the largest and fastest growing private sector employer, both in New York State and the United States for decades, but it has also been the absolute lowest paying employer. Every year, the US Department of Labor puts out a list of the 10 lowest paying occupations in the US. Every year, the 7 lowest of the 10 are all in one industry, the restaurant industry. So how is it that you've got one of the largest and fastest growing industries with the lowest paying wages? Sadly, it dates back to emancipation, when the restaurant lobby, which later became the National Restaurant Association, and in New York, the affiliates are the New York State Restaurant Association and the New York City Hospitality Alliance. That organization started shortly after emancipation and demanded the right to hire newly freed slaves, not pay them anything at all, and have them live on this newfangled idea that had just come from Europe at the time called tipping. Tipping originated in feudal Europe as an extra or bonus on top of a wage for serfs and vassals. When it came to the States, it came right before emancipation, and the restaurant lobby took it and said, we're going to use this to be able to essentially extend slavery, hire Black people for a $0 wage, and make them work exclusively for tips, which was a mutation of tipping. Tipping was never intended to be a replacement for wages. It was intended to be an extra bonus on top of the wage. So we started at a $0 wage at emancipation. That notion of tips as wage replacement was codified into law as part of the New Deal, when everybody got the right for the minimum wage for the first time in 1938 as part of the New Deal, except for millions of Black workers. Tipped workers were mostly Black, mostly women. They were left out of the New Deal. They were told you can get a $0 wage as long as tips bring you to the full minimum wage. And we went from zero in 1938 all the way up to $2.13 an hour at the federal level. And today, 43 states persist with this legacy of slavery, including the state of New York, where tipped workers get 66% of the overall wage. Now, the overwhelming majority of these workers are not white guys working in fancy fine dining restaurants. Even in New York City, the overwhelming majority of tipped restaurant workers are women. It's over 2/3 of tipped restaurant workers that are women. They're mostly women working as waitresses, servers, bartenders, mostly in very casual restaurants in New York City and across the state. They struggle with 3 times the poverty rate of other workers and the absolute highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry in the US, because they have to tolerate inappropriate customer behavior in order to get those tips. Now, there are 7 states that always did it differently, including where I now live, California, but also Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska. All these 7 states have required a full minimum wage with tips on top for decades. And if you look at the data, it shows that actually restaurants grow faster in these 7 states. Small business restaurants grow faster. Tipping averages are higher. Poverty rates are much lower, and there is 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry in California and the 7 states with one fair wage. Why? Because women in those states don't have to rely entirely on the tip. They don't have to put up with as much from customers because they can count on a wage from their boss, like every other worker in every other industry. So if somebody tries to touch them or harass them, they can say, buzz off. I know I'm getting a wage regardless of whether you tip me. Whereas if you live in a state like New York, where a substantial portion of your income is your tips, you're going to have to tolerate whatever comes your way from customers in order to get that tip. And that power dynamic between customers and servers got so much worse with the pandemic. So with the pandemic, 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs in March of 2020. And 2/3 of those workers reported to us in New York and across the country where they earned a sub-minimum wage. They were mostly told they couldn't get unemployment insurance, or they got very reduced amounts of unemployment insurance because of their sub-minimum wage. Many tipped workers in New York were told your wage is too low to qualify for benefits, or we can't see your tips, so they don't count towards a calculation of unemployment insurance. Then many workers felt compelled to go back to work in the summer of 2020 when there was all that outdoor dining. And they found that tips had gone way down because sales were down, and customer hostility and harassment and health risks went way up. Thousands of women reported to us during the pandemic that they were regularly asked, take off your mask so I can see how cute you are, before I decide how much to tip you. Take off your mask so I can see the pretty face of my server before I decide how much I want to tip. We heard this so frequently, it became a phenomenon that we coined a term for called masculine harassment. And the nation's leading legal scholar on sexual harassment, Catherine McKinnon, ended up working with us to publish a series of reports on this really horrifying increase in harassment during the pandemic. What really was the breaking point for so many workers was that in 2020 and then in 2021, these workers were asked to do so much more for so much less. They were asked to enforce social distancing and mask rules and other COVID protocols on the very same customers from whom they had to get tips to make up their base wage. It was an impossible situation. Workers reported that if they tried to enforce the rules, they were tipped less. And so they were hesitant to enforce the rules because they knew they would lose their tips. And so they had to choose between their health and safety and getting those tips. And it was an impossible situation, all for so much less in tips than they had gotten before. And literally 1 million workers left the industry. We just published a report in December. 1 million workers have left the industry nationwide. And a full 12% of that, 120,000 workers, have left the industry from New York. New York has the highest rate of restaurant workers leaving the industry of any state in the US. It's actually double the national average of workers leaving the restaurant industry. 1 in 10 workers left the industry nationally. 1 in 5 restaurant workers left the industry in New York. We surveyed 3,000 of them all throughout last year. 50% of those who remain say they're leaving the industry. 90% of New Yorkers who say they're leaving the industry say the only thing that would make them stay or come back to work in restaurants is a full livable wage with tips on top. So we have moved from this issue being an issue of race and gender injustice to becoming a horrific, unhealthy, horrific situation for workers during the pandemic, really a matter of life and death, to now becoming a matter of life and death for this industry. Restaurants are not going to be able to fully reopen unless wages go up. And we have tracked, in the response to so many workers leaving the industry, 3,000 or 4,000 restaurants nationally and 500 in New York, raising their wages voluntarily to 15 plus tips in order to get staff to come back to work. Because those small independent restaurants know what we know, which is workers aren't coming back unless wages go up. And those independent restaurants, about 2,000 of which are part of our association Raise, they've said to us, we cannot do it alone. We need Governor Hochul and the legislature to enact this as policy so that we're not raising wages on our own, so that it's a level playing field. And we need policy because what we're finding is that we as individual restaurants, when we try to raise our wages, it's not enough. Workers still aren't coming back. Why? Because they're not dumb and they know it could be temporary. Unless they get a permanent guarantee that these are going to be permanent wage increases going into the next several years, they are not coming back. They are not coming back to this industry. They've been very clear about that. And so we really only have 2 choices in New York. We can either expect that we're going to have an industry that's cut in half because 50% of those who remain are leaving, or we can raise the wage. Those are really the only 2 choices. And so there is a bill that's been moving for several years, currently sponsored by Senator Biaggi in the Senate and Assemblymember Cruz in the Assembly. But I really want to thank Sam and Senator Hoylman, who've been like really one of the top most vocal champions of this issue. And the truth is that we've been working first with Governor Cuomo for many years and now for Governor Hochul to do this through executive action, because it could be done tomorrow. It could be done tomorrow if she chose to act. She told us in the fall, this is one of her top priorities, especially when they saw the violence enacted upon servers who are trying to enforce. I'm sure you guys saw the news stories about workers getting punched up, beaten, even shot for trying to enforce COVID protocols. So when those stories came out, Governor Hochul said, this is one of my top priorities. These workers should be paid. Well, it hasn't happened. She didn't mention it in the State of the State. And it's time. It's so overdue. Otherwise, we just can't get these workers to come back. Now, I do want to mention just one last thing, which is that during the pandemic, we worked with governors and mayors in 7 or 8 different states, including Mayor de Blasio, to run a program called High Road Kitchens, where we raised a total of about $30 million in relief funds for both workers and employers in this industry. And we gave out grants to restaurants that committed to raising wages. And that is a program Governor Hochul has been interested in, keeps asking us about. We've been in discussions with Senator Hoylman and others about could we make that legislation so that as we're raising wages, we're also supporting restaurants with both funding and training. We have a training program that shows the restaurants how to raise these wages profitably. It includes, cash projections, profit and loss statements. We have a calculator that shows you if you just input how many workers you have and the size of your restaurant will show you how you raise wages profitably. We've got the training, the resources, and lots of restaurants already doing it voluntarily. There is just no reason not to do it.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Jim, go ahead. And thank you, Sarah.
What does the industry say? The overall industry?
So remember, the industry is represented by the affiliate of the National Restaurant Association, which is the group that since emancipation has fought to keep this wage.
No. I don't want to. I really don't want to hear about emancipation. 160 odd years ago. I want to know what they're saying now.
They're saying the same thing they've said for 160 years, which is we cannot pay these workers wages. Basically, customers should pay their wages for us through tips. And they have.
We do pay, and there are societies. I mean, there are certain nations where if you go to that country and you are served at a restaurant, it's considered an insult to leave a tip, right? Are you identifying this now as a you're not identifying it as an alternative, and you're saying on the one hand that these restaurants who have adopted the higher wage are asking that you continue to do this across the board for the rest of the state, and that frankly doesn't make any sense to me, because if that were the case, then they would be competing with workers that are in short supply, as you said, across the industry. In other words, if I'm paying $15 and the guy across the street is only paying whatever, $8 or $10 an hour, why would I want him to raise wages equal to mine and create a greater shortage for the wages? That doesn't make any common sense. And the other point I'd like to make is you're aware that in this industry there is a growing supply of server robots. Outside New York City, New York City, you go to a restaurant, whether it's here in Manhattan or up in Arthur Avenue and up in the Bronx, you go in, you're waited on, the server tells you or serves you, and you pay him and tip him accordingly with respect to the service. When you go outside, if you go out into the suburbs, and the suburbs are dominated by these chain restaurants, so you really can't get a decent meal, frankly. You go to these chain restaurants and they'll hand you the equivalent of an iPad, and you input your own order, and then a busboy comes, throws the meal on the table, and you leave. And he leaves. You finish your meal. You get a bill, and you're expected to tip as you would in a regular restaurant. And generally speaking, when I go to a restaurant, I will tip generally about 20% for good service, a little less, 10-15% if it's lousy service. But if standard service, 20%. You're saying now that in addition to whatever additional price that I pay for a meal, I should also continue to tip that 20%, even though, and again, we're talking outside New York City, even though they're cutting down their service staff because of New York State's higher minimum wage. McDonald's, for example, has these kiosks. Are the unions supporting this? Are the restaurant industry, you say, doesn't support it? I can't imagine that the servers support this, because I know guys who do quite well as waiters because they serve, at upscale restaurants. It just doesn't make any sense to me what you're proposing. So I'm not at all convinced. And if there's an issue with sexual harassment by waiters, that's an issue for the restaurant manager or the owner, and they should be addressing it. They should just, frankly, throw the customer out of the restaurant. I know guys who run restaurants. None of them would tolerate any of their servers being sexually harassed. None of them. So you have to explain this a little better to get me on board.
So first of all, about 17,000 tipped workers have signed a petition to the governor and the legislature asking them to sign this in the last few months. And the
Restaurant servers?
restaurant
servers?
Yes, restaurant servers. 17,000 workers and over 100 restaurant owners have signed a letter and a petition to the legislature and the governor asking them to do this. The workers are saying we cannot work for a sub-minimum wage anymore. We cannot live on the instability of tips. We need a full wage with tips on top. The workers are saying we won't go back to work unless we get a full minimum wage with tips on top. I mean, it's way beyond do workers want this. They're not willing to work for these jobs anymore without it. And in terms of the employers who are saying we need this to be a level playing field, they're saying two things. First, we're at a disadvantage. We're at a competitive disadvantage if we're raising wages to recruit staff and all of these, IHOPs and Denny's continue to pay a sub-minimum wage. It puts us at a competitive disadvantage. Our industry does operate in terms of trying to make everything a level playing field because there's so much competition in terms of prices. But what they're saying a second thing, which is it's actually not enough. We're raising wages and we still can't get enough people to come back because the workers know that us raising wages alone could be temporary, that we as individual restaurants might go back to paying a lower wage next year. And so they're not willing to come back unless the government guarantees that the wage is going up, that this is policy across the board and the wage is going up. Now, to your comments about robots, I've actually spent many years researching this. I live at Silicon Valley, where most electronics, robotics have been thought of and tried. And frankly, they have failed in the restaurant industry. We have studied many, many attempts at automated restaurant service. They have failed, and they've never resulted in fewer jobs. San Francisco is the place where the most automation in the restaurant industry was attempted and has the highest wages with tips on top. So everything I'm talking about, we already do here in California and in San Francisco. We already pay 15 plus tips and more. And we've had the most attempts at automation. It's gone nowhere. There's actually a higher job growth rate here in California than there is in other places. So automation has not there's been no real automation replacement of workers because wages have gone up. Are labor unions behind it? Absolutely. Every labor union.
What do you call the iPad? What do you call the iPads if they're not?
Yeah, so I just want to.
Can we move on? And let somebody
And
else-
also,
several
can I also make one other point? You said
Okay, we have people with their hands up, so I just want to give everyone an opportunity.
New York State Department of Labor, New York State Department of Labor counts 317,000 restaurant workers in New York State. So you're talking about 5% of the worker population in your position.
Well, it's a huge workforce.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jim, for your comments.
Go ahead.
Both B and Claude have their hand up, so I just want to give them an opportunity to speak.
B can go first.
Thanks, Claude. Thanks, Sarah, for hearing. Sarah, I have a number of comments listening to the debate and listening to Jim. I had worked for the Social Security Administration for many years, and I think you will remember in your historical stuff, the same debate took place when it was the question of covering tips for Social Security purposes. There was a lot of what I'm hearing now was on the table. But to me, this is a fundamental issue because it's not just the unemployment insurance that people weren't eligible for. It becomes an economic equity issue for the future and the aging of America. If you have this very low base, you're also going to have a very low benefit under Social Security. You may need SSI. You're going to have the question of eligibility for Medicare, Medicaid. So this is very foundational to me and very, very significant. I did want to ask you a question about the bill when I was looking at it, because maybe I interpreted it incorrectly. If I'm looking at the Senate bill, it seemed to imply that if you eliminate the substandard wage, when you go to look at tips would then be shared with the I'll call them back office workers, the cooks and other, that there would be a pooling of tips. Did I read that correctly?
That's how it's done in California and the 7 states. And actually, that is a component that the restaurant owners really have pushed for, because and back of house workers, because they feel like it's an equity issue that once you pay everybody a full minimum wage, then tips can be shared among all non-management workers. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought was a positive, because we are then talking about that part of the population that doesn't even have access to tips now. Thanks, Sarah.
I'll just comment slightly because B, you just asked my question. That was the question that I was going to ask, because I saw somewhere in the bill where it addressed sharing of tips. And I wanted to know, once you scale up to minimum above that sub minimum, does the person get individual tips, or must they be shared? But I wanted to comment first in saying that thank you, Saru, for an excellent historical and definitive presentation. And it was very interesting to hear the historical aspects, because I did not know that, and I'm a student of Black history and et cetera. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Even the sharing of tips is actually a racial equity issue. Especially in fine dining, you see this very severe racial segregation with a lot of white servers in the front and people of color in the back. And that has historical roots too, which I won't get into, but what a lot of workers want, employers want, and what we actually experienced during the pandemic was when you pay everybody a full minimum wage, and then you're able to actually share tips with the back of the house, it creates greater equity between front and back. It creates greater racial equity and the ability then for what we call cross-training, for people to move from back to front, to get promoted. Right now, there's such a division. The front gets less of a wage and the tips, the back gets a full wage. But when you bring it all together, everybody gets a full wage and the tips are shared. There's just so many benefits across the board. People work together better. You get better meals and service. Actually, sexual harassment goes down, which I can explain further. There's just so many benefits to a unified workforce.
I had a question in terms of, when I was reading the legislation, what about the other tip workers, like especially nail salons? So would be included in this as well?
That's right. All sub minimum wage tipped workers would be included. Nail salon, car wash, parking attendants, airport wheelchair attendants, everybody a lot of those workers, B is right, did get one fair wage through executive action, but this bill would actually codify and institutionalize a full minimum wage for them as well.
And because that's something I've heard from people in different kind of those kind of services, right? Whether it's the eyebrow threading and nail salons, how they're actually getting paid very little and working in very difficult conditions over the past year.
Yeah, and I do just want to say to Jim and to everybody, this is actually what already happens in hotels. You tip quite often the housekeeping staff when you stay at a hotel, but they get a full livable wage with the tips on top. So hotels already do it. And all the restaurants in California and the 7 states already do it. And now 500 restaurants in New York State at least are already doing it. And actually during the pandemic, when it was all takeout and delivery, everybody did it. And so this is not anything radical or new. This is something that a lot of restaurants are saying is the future of the industry. And frankly, has already been the way it's worked in hotels and restaurants in 7 states.
Are there any other questions from committee members? If not, we can also see if there's any questions from the public. See if there's anything in the Q&A.
Just you do recognize that people will tip less now.
That's not true. Actually, we studied this as well. No, actually, that's not true. Actually, California and the 7 states have a higher tipping average than New York. San Francisco has the highest tipping average of any city in the US, higher than New York City. Alaska, which has had one fair wage, has the highest tipping average of any state, higher than New York State's. So actually what the data shows is that when you pay these workers more, guess what they do? They go out and spend it. They eat out and they tip better. Restaurant workers tip better than other workers. Tipping averages are higher where people get a full minimum wage, not less.
Oh, I can tell you that anecdotally, I will drop my tip down to the regular 10 or 15%, whatever people normally tip.
Right.
Assuming that you have this kind, the kind of price increases that you're talking about. I mean, hard to get a decent
Most people
service in a
don't tip
decent
based
restaurant
on,
now anyway.
most people don't
And
tip based on how much a server makes. Nobody actually cares when they go in. People don't go into a restaurant and
no, they
ask
based on
how much do you earn before they tip. They tip based on the service.
they base it on the price of the check. I mean, it's 20% of the check.
Right.
And
They don't say I'm going to tip.
there's
Ask the server how much are you
Right.
how much do you earn before they decide the percentage.
No, of
That's
course not. Of course not. But the point is that this law will go through, prices will go up accordingly in order to accommodate the higher wages. And the tips will, at least in my case, will reduce. And I'll probably end up going out less than I do now. And I'll be honest with you, the level of service in most of these restaurants these days is not very good. People are not being trained to be good service providers. And you can sit in a restaurant, wait for a waiter to come around, wait for your food. You got to chase somebody down to get a drink. People are not trained the way they used to be, frankly.
I think you've just proved my point, Jim. A lot of excellent restaurant workers have left the industry because they can't work for these wages anymore. So if we want really excellent professional workers to come back to this industry, we have to raise the wage. You get what you pay for.
And I think
Not really good.
and that's a choice. And that's a choice for the restaurant.
Gotta pay more.
That's a choice for the restaurant owner. That's a choice for the restaurant owner, not the legislators in Albany who are not. They don't have any skin in the game. They're not at risk.
And Jim, you need to up your grade of restaurants.
And also,
I've seen some pretty good ones there, but I'm telling you that it's not what it used to be.
They absolutely have skin in the game when our industry has the highest rates of public assistance usage of any industry in the US. Absolutely, the legislature, the taxpayer has skin in the game because right now, beyond paying for these workers' wages through our tips, we spend literally $9 billion annually on taxpayer-funded public assistance for workers who cannot survive on sub-minimum wages. So absolutely, there is an implication for the taxpayer and the government when workers are underpaid.
Well, I suspect you will be adding some restaurant owners to those lists as well if this legislation goes through.
and so, Jim, we are going to discuss as a committee about our resolution and, how we feel about that. And we can have a longer discussion about.
No, I'm going to vote against it. I mean, that's,
Yeah.
we can, whatever, we can make the resolution, but I'm going to oppose it. Just, this is Albany getting its hands into something where it's not, it has no expertise. And where, as I say, they're not the ones that put their life savings into a restaurant. They're not the ones that work there 24/7, in many instances, 16 hours a day, 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's no holiday for restaurant owners. There's often no holiday for restaurant workers. Market will meet this demand for their employees, and Albany should really stay out of it. Well,
I mean, the other way you can look at it is there's no holiday if you're ever poor. Like you just never have a break. Life never stops crushing you. And that's a much bigger moral concern than how restaurants structure their finances. I mean, it's possible that changing these kinds of laws may create individual cases where, at that moment in time, a particular restaurant may have to make very big changes to accommodate a salary restructure. But we're talking about a minimum wage where everybody else in the economy works for the regular minimum wage. And this does not actually discourage restaurant ownership or the number of restaurants when other jurisdictions have passed similar legislation. So, considering the downsides of the current system and the fact that most or everybody will adapt to it, and the people who own restaurants have significantly more equity and more wealth than the people who are working for the restaurants, and thus, the people who actually really need the help are the poor people who are working for the restaurants. I think that this move takes a step in a positive direction to try to put everybody on a similar level. And there also are a lot of food service workers who work for our regular minimum wage, and those restaurants are open and healthy. And I haven't heard of any broad problems of anybody paying their restaurant workers more and then having to go out of business.
Thank you, Brian. Steve O would like to speak.
To comment on the challenges that a business might have with raised wages, I'd argue this welcomes businesses for a chance to evolve and change. One of the common topics that speak on larger industries that they use the example of the Forbes top 100 companies from 50 years ago. 75% of them are not here today because they try to keep the business the same way they've always done things, and they've been overtaken. And today's Forbes top companies won't be there as well if they don't keep changing with the industry changing how things are. And I welcome the same idea with restaurants. New York City is one of the restaurant capitals of the world. The tipping industry in all industries in general has always been an odd thing. It's funny, before this legislation came up, I always wondered how people survived in this city with the sub minimum wage and be able to commute back and forth with this type of structure. If the companies find it challenged to pay for this, some other enterprising restaurateur or business owner is going to find a way and let them take over, pay their people the proper wage, and welcome a whole new way of doing things. If we keep the way things have always been, that part would concern me, because I think that'll just not introducing change will just let an industry like this die in something that should be as dynamic in one of the restaurant capitals of the world.
Thank you, Steve. And I'd like to add that, in Europe, where, as was mentioned earlier by Jim, that, where they don't tip, but you're getting a certain amount of wage that's sufficient for you to live by. Yes. Going to Brian's point. So even if people aren't tipping enough, they're still making more than $2.25, right? And so in the end, they're still better off if they aren't even getting as much tip.
Yeah, I think this has been the same comment that's why I keep going back historically. There's been the same prediction by the Restaurant Association for 150 years. You make us pay more, we're going to go out of business. You make us pay more, we go out of business. It has never happened. in any state, including in New York, raised its wage to $15 an hour. And before they did, the Restaurant Association said the same thing, where this is going to put us out of business, and it did not. Since the wage went up to 15 in New York State, the restaurant business has grown. And it's grown faster in the states that have had one fair wage. And those 7 states, by the way, we also studied how many restaurants closed during the pandemic. Those states lost fewer restaurants than New York. Why? Because consumer spending was more stable, because restaurant workers were more stable. So we've seen a more stable industry and economy where the restaurants are, everybody's paid a full wage. And even the CFO of Denny's admitted it. It was in Newsweek a few months ago. The CFO of Denny's in a shareholder meeting said actually paying 15 with tips on top in California has resulted in Denny's outperforming the system, growing faster in California than any state in the US, because consumer spending is, because our workers go out and they spend it in restaurants, and consumer spending is higher, so the company is growing faster. Small business growth rates are higher in California and the 7 states than they are in New York. New York, on the other hand, lost more workers than any other state in the US because the sub-minimum wage is just not livable in New York City or New York State. So if we want workers to come back, if you want those great professional, well-trained workers to come back, we've got to pay them.
I think the reason that we lost workers in New York is because so much of the industry was shut down by the pandemic rules imposed by the government.
Industry was shut down in California.
When you look, huh?
Industry was shut down in all of those states. Yeah, industry was shut down everywhere. Industry was shut down in California for longer than it was in New York, actually.
As to the CFO of Denny's, perhaps he's growing his restaurant faster because he's helping to drive independent restaurants out of business. Denny's has a pretty solid balance sheet, whereas the average independent restaurant owner, the guy who runs a coffee shop, for example, doesn't have that kind of balance sheet, can't afford to pay those wages, gets driven out of business, has to fire his workers, and then they all go to work for Denny's.
Independent
So
restaurant
I'm not really not buying into your equity argument.
Independent restaurants have grown faster in California than they have in New York, if you look at the data.
Well,
I mean,
California,
Denny's had a restaurant in Manhattan that they had to close a year before the pandemic.
Oh, I did not know Denny's ever was in New York City. Yeah.
Yes,
Oh yeah, it was in the financial district. It was like
yes.
It was a block off of Park Row. It was like right there by Pace. Yeah, it was pretty good, except they couldn't swing it in Manhattan. But apparently all these other restaurants that are independently owned can.
B has her hand up again.
Yeah, so I guess my hand up is we're having our own internal debate with Sarah.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
I really think that we have to thank Sarah, and if we're going to do a resolution, it's time for the debate. It's not time for cross, conversations as if there's a witness on the stand.
Thank you, B, for pointing that out. And so, Saru, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Sam. And Sam, I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to add.
No, Saru said it very eloquently and made a lot of great points. It's a piece of legislation that has a lot of data behind it, despite some anecdotes that we've heard. And we are looking forward to working with everybody to move it forward.
All right, thank you. And thank you again, both, for taking time to speak with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Just one more thing though, Brendan, I just want to make sure that there was no questions from the public.
I see a member of the public has their hand raised, but I noted in the chat that anyone from the public who has any questions should type their questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom. I do not see any questions in that Q&A feature.
Okay.
I do see Saru's hand is raised though.
Oh, sorry, that was a mistake.
Okay.
Oh, sorry about that.
Okay, well, thank you both. I just wanted to make sure that we didn't have any other questions for you before you left.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, everybody, for your comments. And as we mentioned earlier, we as a committee should now decide if we want to draft a resolution in favor of the bill that's in the state Senate, S808. And, Senator Hoylman, who is from our area, is one of the co-sponsors of the bill. There is an equivalent bill in the state assembly. The sponsors are not, those are in our district though, but we could draft a resolution in favor of both bills. So anyone have thoughts, want to make a motion?
I do, sorry to interrupt, but I do want to make a note that we do have a member of the public who has typed something in the Q&A feature.
Oh, okay. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, unfortunately, the speakers are left, but let me read the question. So why not let the market regulate itself? I'm not an economist to answer that question. And I think it's a matter of opinion, and one could argue that the market has been regulating itself. And as we pointed out, as Bea and Brian said in much better terms earlier, is that we have people who work in the restaurant industry and other industries where they're being paid sub-minimum wage, where they are not able to survive. And during this pandemic, we saw how people couldn't even pay 1 month's rent, when the pandemic started. And that's why we've had to do so much rent relief, and so many other people who've fallen below the poverty line as a result of not being paid a living wage. And the other thing I wanted to, this one didn't come up in the discussion, but what's interesting to me, I only learned when reading this legislation, is that people with disabilities are being paid sub-minimum wage just because they have disabilities, which is, this bill would rectify that. Bea? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I don't know if this bill would rectify the disability thing, because I think that's a question of people that are doing sheltered work or other types of training work. So I didn't see that in the bill. I was going to make a recommendation, because this is complicated. I was going to propose that we do a resolution supporting it, but we bring it back to our next committee meeting so we could have a full discussion. I think in hearing the questions from most people are supportive, but this is complex. I would prefer the governor to do an executive order the way Como did, but I think this resolution will take a little time to evolve. So that would be my recommendation, that we go ahead and do it, but debate it at our next meeting.
And thank you for that recommendation. And given that full board is also just tomorrow, that I didn't think we would get to a point where we'd have a resolution to present for this month. So Bea, do you want to make a motion?
Yeah, I make a motion that we write a resolution supporting the action of the legislature or the governor, whichever is quicker, and that we bring it to our next committee meeting to have a full discussion.
I second it.
Okay, thank you, Bea and Claude. So we will be discussing this at our next meeting and consider proposing a resolution either to the state legislature or to the governor for this action. So we can move to other committee business now, unless anyone has anything else they'd like to add. One piece of information that we just received as our meeting was starting is that as we had spent considerable amount of time in August and September talking about the open meetings law. And so there has been some movement on that. As you know, that the open meetings law had only been extended up to January 15th to allow for virtual. And it has been extended further by the state assembly. Dick Godfrey's office sent an email to CB6 office, and Brendan informed me of this. We would still need it to pass the legislature, right, Brendan, if that's my understanding?
Okay, so it's a very fluid situation, as indicated by the fact that Assemblymember Gottfried's office emailed me about 10 minutes before 7 saying that a bill on this has also passed the state Senate. So I guess it's only a matter of getting a signature from the governor. But yeah, there are some very recent developments on this.
Well, thank you. So, it's not set in stone, but it looks like it will happen. And, our meeting is, our meeting and full board are before the 15th, but then if that legislation doesn't, we would have to consider in-person meetings for February.
Does that bill have a date right now? Is it extended through a specific date?
The email does not say if it's extended to a specific date, that the email that we got that's saying that it just said extended beyond January 15th. Is that correct, Brendan, in your understanding?
So to answer B's question, the extension would be to the end of the declared emergency. So it's not a specific date from the sound of things, but to the end of the emergency. I can also post a link to this bill in the chat. I've literally just heard about this right before tonight's meeting, so I haven't had a chance to look at the bill and look at the actual text. But from what Assemblymember Gottfried's office told me, it's until the end of the emergency.
No, thank you, Brendan, and thank you for bringing it to our attention so quickly as well.
No problem.
Yeah. And so I just want to, give everyone an update on that. And once we get a chance to take a look at the link and get more information, we will share that with everybody via email. And as you know, for our February meeting, we wanted to reschedule perhaps. There was a doodle poll that was sent out because our next regularly scheduled meeting of the Budget and Governmental Affairs Committee falls on Valentine's Day, which may not work for some committee members. A few people have already responded, but we wanted to make sure we got a response from everyone before rescheduling, because we wanted to make sure that we can have a quorum for the meeting. And so for the record, the alternative meeting dates up for consideration are Wednesday, February 2nd, Thursday, February 3rd, Tuesday, February 8th, Tuesday, February 16th, or Wednesday, February 23rd. And Brendan, can you put the link to the doodle poll in the chat as well, in case people have lost the email?
Yep, it's in the chat right now.
Okay, thank you.
And I know several of you have responded to the doodle poll. So if you've responded, there's no need to respond a second time. Let me also check the poll to see how many of you who are present have responded, because I know a number of you have. Yeah, a number of you who are here have responded to the poll.
Okay, so we need to basically hear from people who aren't in attendance today. If anyone has any thoughts on the rescheduling, if anyone has any strong feelings about not rescheduling, also please let us know. And once we have an agreed upon date, we will send out that information for everyone, so you know well in advance of the meeting. So that's all I had. Does anyone have any old or new business they'd like to discuss?
Yes,
sorry to
I
interrupt.
do.
Okay, was that Claude? I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Yes.
Claude can go first. I was going to say something as well related to rescheduling.
I just want to apprise the committee of something that I've been trying to do for a number of years, and it seems to be right at the point where maybe people can get an understanding of it. We always do our budgeting priorities and we get to the school system and we never seem to get it right. And we send people out to the schools and ask the principals what are their priorities, what are their wishes. And I keep saying that is not how it works, that the Board of Ed has a 5-year capital budget plan that they proceed on. This week happens to be the key point in that scenario. The CEC 2 is having a meeting tomorrow of their zoning and capital planning committee. That committee meets with school construction authority, and they go through the presentations of what they want to put on their capital budget. It's kind of senseless for us to come months later and ask the principals when it's already been worked out between the district and the Central Board of Education. For anybody that would like to know and understand that process better, you can attend the meeting tomorrow at 5 o'clock of the CEC and the School Construction Authority. Or you can look at it on YouTube. They also have a YouTube presentation. Now, because Gail was the borough president, she's really up on this, so she knows probably better than some of you, the council members, that this week on the 14th is the deadline for the council members to submit their capital budget presentations for the schools. So even the council members will have already put in their items by the 14th of this month. So just a suggestion to anybody that's on this committee that really wants to become familiar with how that operates, so that later on in the year, we don't go to the principals and say, well, do you have a capital item that you want done, like the alarms? And they've already gone through the process of doing it, and the council member already knows that they've gone through that process. And we're now saying, well, where do we put this in our priorities? We should be aware of the process when it begins for that different silo than us in the budgeting process. And it begins now in January for the schools. So for us, CEC 2 has a meeting tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Their zoning and capital planning committee meeting with school construction authorities. And anybody can attend that meeting, and then you can really get an idea of what their priorities are.
Thank you, Claude, for bringing that up. And I will try to join that. And anyone else wants to join, I think that would be helpful. Or if the YouTube president, because I know we have full board tomorrow too. So
yes,
it might be a lot for people, but since it's on YouTube, what I'll do is find that link and then send it to Brendan to share with everybody. So people can look at it at their leisure.
Well, if Brendan gets the minutes from the CEC, it might be in that. I don't know if he gets that.
I don't think I do.
Well, you could probably contact the CEC and they probably could send it to you because they just put out the schedule.
Okay, that's very helpful. I mean, in our February meeting, we'll be discussing, because I'm assuming that OMB will have given us a response as well, because it happens in January to our community needs that we submitted at the end of October. And we'll be starting that whole process again, and it'll be good to know what the schools need from the get-go. Does anyone else have any other business? Brian?
Motion to adjourn.
Rick always would say, I don't think we need a second to adjourn. I think he was the one who always said that. So I think this meeting is adjourned at 7:42 p.m.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you for the presentation. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, and thank you all for joining.
Good
And I
night.
guess we
See
will
everyone
see-
tomorrow.
Yeah, see you tomorrow.
Claude,
Maybe we'll see you
Claude,
tomorrow
is that
night.
meeting, Claude, is that meeting tomorrow? Is that linked? Is it a virtual meeting or yeah, it's in person?
It's
It's
a
virtual.
it's a virtual meeting, and it's also on YouTube, just like we are.
Okay. Could you send a link?
I don't have a link. I can send you. They have a website, it's cecd2.net.
Okay.
Yeah, Jim,
All right.
I'll email it to you because I'm on the site right now looking for it.
All right. Very
Yeah,
well.
since we're still chatting,
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay,
I can send a link in the chat right now since we're
okay,
still-
you have it then, here.
I'm on dial-up, so I'm not.
Oh, that's
Okay.
right. You're on the
Yeah,
you're-
I'll email it to
Okay.
Jim.
All right. I appreciate it. Thank
Okay.
you. Take care. Bye-bye
Bye.
now.
Okay. In any event, I hope everyone has a good night.
Yes, thank you, and thank you,
All right,
Brendan,
have
for
a
your
good
help.
one.